Thank you, Ali. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for participating in these workshops. No doubt these are important times, um, and I'm happy to see so many people committed to confronting difficult questions. Um, So most importantly, we're not here just to work through difficult ideas. We're here to consider, what is to be done to make real change. And today, I'm going to try to take on one of the core criticisms to emerge from the George Floyd rebellion, from the recent BLM protests. And that core criticism is the idea that policing maintains and reproduces structural racism, right? That policing itself is the problem. Um, in other words, I'm going to explain the logic behind the demand to defund the police and reinvest in care. Now, I know this demand sounds extreme and unworkable to many. In a recent op-ed for the New York Times, Miriam Kaba, one of the most influential and acclaimed abolitionists in the United States today, suggested reducing police budgets and the number of police officers by 50%. So I'm going to explain why this idea and similar ones should be taken seriously. I'm going to explain how Maine is not exempt from problems related to structural racism. I'm going to challenge us to push for bold action to address these problems. In short, I'm asking us to act with courage and confront the full gravity of this historical moment. But before I get into it, who am I and why am I talking about this issue? So my name is Brendan McQuade. I'm a assistant professor in the criminology department at the University of Southern Maine. A year ago, the University of California Press published my book on police intelligence systems, pacifying the homeland, intelligence fusion, and mass supervision. But it's not my academic credentials that have put me in this position. It's how I've developed my academic research and put it to work. So as a kind of ethical and political commitment, I try to think with social movements. So I try to conduct my research in dialogue with social movements and in relation to the debates that are, most meaningful to them, right? And this also requires my, participation in movement work, right? So in the past, I've worked extensively with groups opposing jail expansion in upstate New York and fighting police violence in Chicago. My current political home is the Southern Maine Democratic Socialists of America, and from this perch, I've worked with Maine Youth Justice and Black Lives Matter Portland. I say all this not to puff up my feathers, but to establish a different kind of expertise, one that in many ways is more important than my academic credentials. So I'm here today to kind of explain and amplify the radical demands emerging from our tear gas choked streets. I'm not here to make the movement more palpable to those in power, to explain how we can co-opt the movement with half measures, blunt its demands, etc. I'm here to provide an extremely radical review of policing. And by this, I mean radical in the strict sense of the term. We're going to cut to the core issues. We're going to cut to the root of the problem. And we're going to think about, what bold actions are needed, not just to fundamentally transform, criminal justice in Maine, but the social structures that shape our world. So specifically, I'm going to cover 7 points today. First, I'm going to, review aspects of structural racism in Maine as it relates to policing. Second, I'm going to debunk the central myth of policing. Policing is not law enforcement, it's order maintenance, right? Third, I'm going to discuss the centrality of discretion to police power and why this makes police reform a dead end. Fourth, I'm going to return to these questions of social order and argue that the social order that police continually reproduces is best understood as racial capitalism. Fifth, and a related point, I'm going to explain how this, or excuse me, Yeah, fifth, and as a related point, I'm going to explain how this deeper history of policing recasts all of social policy as a softer form of social policing. To wrap things up, I'm going to try to shift to, from critique to a, positive argument about the possibilities of the present. I'm going to argue that the antithesis of the police is the commons, and explain how this can help us think about reform in ways that keep us addressing real problems, and rather than simply patching up the legitimacy of failed institutions. And then finally, I'm going to conclude with some concrete proposals for what we can do to start building a new Commonwealth of humanity here in Maine. Right. So this is some pretty lofty stuff. We're going to go look at police stats, dive into the 16th century, cover a lot of ground. Right. But let's start with the most specific problem we're dealing with, which is structural racism in Maine. So since Maine is such a white state, it's tempting to think that there are not issues with structural racism here. That's simply not the case. There's much to say about this topic, but I'm going to just address a few issues that are particularly relevant to policing. So first, arrest disparities. So there are systemic biases in arrest patterns. So in 2019, there was an independent assessment conducted by the Council on State Governments, their Justice Center Research Institute. They found that Black people in Maine are more frequently arrested by their white peers. So statewide in 2018, only 1% of the state's population was Black, but Black people accounted for 5% of all arrests and 16% of all Class A felonies, which is the highest offense next to murder. When it came to drug disparities, the drug offenses, the disparities were even greater. So even though abundant research shows that Black and white people possess and use drugs at essentially the same rate, Black people represent about 8% of drug arrests, right? Which is 8%, 8 times their proportion of the population of Maine. So when we look deeper, it gets worse. The report also found that the more serious the charge, the greater the racial disparity. Black people accounted for 21% of Class A drug offenses, 15% of Class B drug offenses, and 4% of Class C drug offenses. In Portland last year, Black people represented 8.3% of the population, but accounted for more than double that proportion of arrests. Now this is actually an improvement from 2013, when Black people accounted for 18% of the arrests made by the Portland police. So these numbers don't give us a full sense of the problem. They're incomplete. While many police agencies in other states collect information about the racial makeup of people they arrest, search, and use force against, Maine police agencies don't track that information or don't do it consistently or in a way that can be fully analyzed. And so today, police chiefs and other officials in the criminal legal system in Maine will speak frankly about racial bias, right? They'll acknowledge the disparities in arrests and sentencing. And of course they have to, given the way the political climate has changed. But when the situation was different, when public sentiment was more on the side of law enforcement and much less skeptical of police, the Department of Public Safety and the Maine Sheriff's Association lobbied to block a bill to prevent that would have improved police data collection and allowed the state and outside researchers to more easily measure arrest patterns and combat racial profiling, right? So that's the issue with arrest disparities in arrest and sentencing. We also have serious problems in incarceration. So across the country, prison populations have been declining for a decade. The state and federal prison population as a whole in the United States is down 9% since 2010. But in Maine, prison populations are growing. Since 2000, Maine's prison population is up 44%. Black people make a disproportionate percentage of the incarcerated population. In 2017, 9% of incarcerated people in Maine were Black. The next year, the figure rose to 12%. Again, the proportion of Black people sentenced increased with the offense level. Nearly a quarter, about 23% of sentences for Class A felonies were given to Black people. That same year, 9% of the people arrested, 9% of the people who were sentenced had legal addresses outside of Maine. About half of them were Black. So I say this just to give us a brief sense of the problem here, right? The racial disparities in arrests, in incarceration that plague, the criminal legal system across the United States are also, at work and clearly on display in Maine. So why, right? Why is anti-Black racism such a systemic problem in law enforcement and the criminal legal system? Right? There's something much greater at work than personal attitudes and individual decisions. This isn't a problem of bad apples. This is a structural problem. Policing is so inseparable from structural racism because of what policing is. It isn't law enforcement. It's order maintenance, and the order that policing maintains is a racist one. So this is a challenging statement. It's a controversial statement. It's one that can only be aired because of the tremendous impact of the George Floyd rebellion and continuing protests and organizing campaigns. It's also a radical statement in that it cuts to the core of both police power and the structure of the modern world. So I'll deal with each of these in turn. So first, let's deal with what's one of the main myths of policing. Policing is not law enforcement. We know policing is not about crime control because criminal law enforcement represents a very small part of police work. The overwhelming majority of calls for police assistance are for service rather than crime related. In an average year, only 15 to 20% of all calls to the police are about crime. Often, the responding officer finds that what's initially reported as crime is not, in fact, a criminal matter. Right? Studies have also shown that less than a third of the time spent on duty is crime-related work. Approximately 8 out of 10 incidents handled by patrols by a range of different police departments are regarded by the police themselves as non-criminal matters. The percentage of police effort that's devoted to traditional criminal law matters probably does not exceed 10%. As little as 6% of a patrol officer's time may be spent on incidents finally defined as criminal, right? And on top of that, only a very small number of criminal offenses are discovered by the police themselves, right? Moreover, most of the time that the police don't use criminal law to restore order, right? When they respond to a situation, they do not have to rely on arrest, on criminal law to deal with the situation. So in the US, police officers make an average of 1 arrest every 2 weeks. One study found that among 156 officers assigned to a high crime area in New York City, 40% did not make a single felony arrest in a year. In Canada, a police officer on average records 1 indictable crime occurrence a week, makes 1 indictable crime arrest every 3 weeks, and secures 1 indictable crime conviction every 9 months, right? So police don't enforce the law, right? They respond to disorder, right? And let's talk a little bit more about what that entails, right? So police have a relationship to the law, right? But it's not one of enforcement, right? They handle the law after the fact to justify the way they've decided to restore order. So the core of police power is not violence, but it's the discretion to handle the law for the restoration of order. So consider the most basic police interaction, the police stop, right? The reasons for a police stop have never been clear. Walking too fast, walking too slow, being stationary. All of these are grounds for a stop, and all of them have been used unfairly and unequally. Furthermore, right, the courts have refused to define discretion because the defined discretion would be to be a limit, would to limit discretion, right? So it's important to keep in mind that discretion isn't just individual decision making, right? It's organizational and institutional. The courts have refused to provide any predetermined limit on what police can and can't do in any situation. The courts refuse to tell police that they can't drop a bomb on a building, as the Philadelphia police did in 1985, or that they can't use a robot to kill an active shooter with a bomb, as they did in Dallas in 2016. Why? Because you can never tell police ahead of time what is a reasonable or necessary thing to do, because all situations are always and forever unpredictable. Right? So if we think of any criminal situation, right, or any disorderly situation, right, any potentially violent situation, we can immediately understand why you can't legislate that, right? That why you need to leave open the possibility for the responding officer to handle the situation as he sees fit. So what does this mean? This means that, what does this mean for policing? Right? It's not law enforcement. The police do not uniformly enforce the law. Right? What is police? It is discretion. It's the expression of state power as an administrative or executive prerogative to act as seen fit. So if police don't enforce the law, they're not accountable to it either. All of this means, right, that that ideas about reform, right, our simplistic ideas about reform need to be profoundly rethought, right? Um, let's consider the police's relationship to the law. I've already said police do not enforce the law, right? It's a resource they use. They handle the law, right? They also don't deal with the law. They don't think of the law, right? The police deal with threats. So let's think about Michael Brown, right? The black man who was killed in Ferguson, Missouri by the police and sparked, the first large nationwide wave of Black Lives Matter demonstrations. In theory, Michael Brown had rights. He had rights under the law. But Wilson, the police officer who responded, saw him as a threat. The law allowed the officer to murder him in cold blood. Even if the courts found him guilty, the law still allowed Wilson to have the prerogative, right, to have the discretion to take Brown's life in the first place. So this is tyranny, and it's built into the structure of the law. It's built into what philosopher Mark Neoclaus calls the permissive structure of the law, right? The law will never hold police accountable because the police are not meant to be accountable or enforce the law, right? Police handle the law to reinforce order, right? And the law itself will always be variable and open to all sorts of noble and nefarious uses, right? This is because the law is political. The law itself is a product of social struggle, of political contestation. The specific content of the law reflects who won previous battles, right? Slavery was once legal, right? To make it a very crude point, the law is not a reflection of natural right, right? It's a political artifact. It changes. It can be changed by contestation. So if we think about these questions of discretion, right, we can start to get some sense of why many people think the police are beyond reform, why they think abolition is the only logical response. When you have a power that's designed to be unaccountable, right? Police are designed to be unaccountable. They're designed to handle the law, to deal with what's essentially a political problem, disorder, right? You can't, when the police are designed to be unaccountable, right, the reforms that stick to it only make it stronger and more efficient as they cover it with a veneer of legitimacy. So this is why the demand is, defund the police and not reinvent or reimagine or reform the police. So thus far, we've covered the racist outcomes of policing, right? The over criminalization and incarceration of Black and brown people. We can't fix this with tweaks to law or policy because of the real nature of police work and the real nature of police power. Police maintain order with the discretion to handle law and use violence. Right? So that said, let's shift the discussion and talk about the order that police maintain. Right? So today, among activists and others within the orbit of the movement for Black lives, you'll often hear the term racial capitalism. So this term isn't just some cheap polemic, right? It's not just some pretentious way of saying capitalism is racist, right? It's a reference, the point of entry to a particular understanding of the modern world, right? To an entire analysis of the world since the 16th century, right? What some people call, the period of time that's sometimes called modernity, right? Or the modern period, or, capitalism. So if you read classic liberals, this world came to being, naturally, right? Capitalism was something that just happened. So one of the most quoted, most famous quotes from Adam Smith, right, the liberal economist, right, who helped create economics as we know it, right? He said it is necessary, though very slow and gradual consequence of a certain propensity in human nature, which has in view no such extensive utility. The propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. Right? So the traditional story, is that our modern world, our modern world of science and capitalism and industry, right, developed out of a natural human propensity, right, to exchange things, to trade, to maximize utility, right? The idea of racial capitalism belongs to an entirely different genre of explanation. So rather than thinking of something that the capitalism as something people do, right? The production, sale, and purchase of goods and services. Capitalism is thought as a structured set of relations, right? So these structured set of relations begin with this basic Marxist point about the exploitative relationships between labor and capital, right? Between those who have nothing to sell but their labor and those who own the world, right? So while this relationship is modified in its working in particular circumstances, the upshot of capitalist development is that it isn't just about the accumulation of wealth, it's also about the accumulation of misery, right? So before COVID, the three wealthiest people in the United States, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett, controlled more wealth than the bottom half of the US population, some 160 million people, right? So what this means is to have wealth, have the extreme accumulation of wealth represented in these three wealthy billionaires, right? It necessarily entails, it produces the incredible immiseration of, the bottom half of the country, right? So this process, this reciprocal accumulation of wealth and misery, the creation of wealth and poverty, right, is not just something that happens within particular industries or within particular countries. It happens on a world scale, right? So we can think of capitalism not just as a thing that people do, not just as a type of economic exchange. It is a historical system, right? And it's a historical system of unequal power relations on a world scale, right? A global division of labor between peripheral areas and privileged core regions. So just as the wealth of Bezos, Gates, and Buffett, is preconditioned on the poverty of others, so is The development of the United States preconditioned on the underdevelopment of Latin America, right? The development of Europe entails the underdevelopment of Africa, right? These world scale relations, right? These exploitative relations that tie together wealthy and poor regions of the world began to solidify in the 16th century. This is the Big Bang moment of capitalism, right? So what happened in the 16th century? Why in this discussion about systemic racism in Maine in 2020 am I going back, to the 16th century? Why is this relevant? Right? This is what many people might think of as the Columbus moment, the European so-called discovery of the New World. Right? Before this point, before the 16th century, right, Europe was a dull isthmus, far removed from the centers of world culture, commerce, and development. Right? The changes set in place in the 16th century created an entirely new world, right? One in which Europe eventually became the center of all of global wealth and development. So what happened? Right? The plundering of the Aztec and Incan empires, the rush to colonization, the development of the slave trade created a new world order, a new global system. They tied together Western Europe, the Americas, and West Africa into a global trading system, right? A division of labor and a world market. So West Africa, what we would now call Latin America and the Caribbean, became the periphery. They were sites of ruthless exploitation in the production of primary commodities. Europe became the core region. It was home to the gentlest forms of labor control and the production of high profit goods. What became the United States was a buffer region a buffer zone that combined elements of both regions, what's sometimes called the semi-periphery. Right? The South was part of the plantation system, as violent and terrible as any place in the world. The North was a society of small property holders and emerging industries. Before the Industrial Revolution, it was timber, shipbuilding, and trade. Right. So in the 16th century, these basic relations were put in place. Right. This global division of labor between different regions of the world. Right. That produced, these distinct poles where misery and wealth would accumulate. Right. Wealth in the core, misery in the periphery. In the intervening 400 years, right, this system developed a gravity of its own, right? It pulled into the rest of the world into it, right? And it integrated previously unincorporated regions within the world market and within the global division of labor. So the story is very complex. Over time, the details change. Right? Industries that were once cutting edge, the textile factories that started this whole mess, are now located in the poorest zones of the world economy. The roles of different regions, geographic areas in the global division of labor changes, right? The politics, right? The exact, rise and fall of states, how states formed, is a long and complex story. There's much that could be said, right, about the roles of Spain and Portugal and why they fell behind the Netherlands, France, and the United Kingdom, right? Even though they had the early lead in the Americas, right? Or how the United States went from a semi-peripheral country to a core country and a world power. How China and India were finally overtaken by Europe, right? But the basic point in communicating in this analysis is as true in 2020 as it was in 1820 or 1620. Right? And this is that capitalism is a global system, right? It's not just, something entrepreneurs do. It is a social system, and it's one that polarizes wealth and power on a world scale. So the idea of racial capitalism builds further on this analysis. Everything I just said about, capitalism as a system is, something that's broadly agreed upon by many different schools of thought in the history and social science. Right? There's other approaches that contest it and provide, alternative explanations as well, right? But this argument I presented here, has some broad acceptance. What's specific about the idea of racial capitalism? What this adds to this critique of modernity is to kind of rethink the nature of domination, right? So domination, social domination, is not just the exploitative relationship between labor and capital, right? What the idea of racial capitalism says is that the nature of domination is best understood as a colonial imperial relation between racially dominant groups and racially subordinate groups, right? It's characterized by gratuitous violence, the free appropriation of labor, and social exclusion. So, what does this mean? Right? The worker is exploited at work, sometimes quite violently, but he's paid and he's socially included, even if only in the most minimal sense that he is a legal subject that can voluntarily make and leave contracts of employment. The slave, on the other hand, is thoroughly dehumanized, right? They can be subject to the most brutal violence with no cause. This is what we mean by gratuitous violence, right? They're socially excluded. They're not members of the polity. They're not viewed as human. So sociologists have called this a condition of social death, right? Black philosophers have recently made this idea of social death the center of a whole analysis of anti-Black racism, right? That's sometimes called Afro-pessimism, which, despite being an incredibly esoteric idea, right? I first heard about this from a BLM activist in Chicago, not from any professor or colleague in academia. So, there's much more that can be said about racial capitalism, about Afro-pessimism, about anti-Blackness, that I can't develop right now, right? I'm squeezing kind of 2 semester-long graduate courses into one PowerPoint slide here. So hopefully the points are clear enough, right? My goal is just to introduce a different understanding of the present order of things, a different understanding of the modern world, a different way to think about everything about social, political, and historical reality, right? So when a BLM activist of a certain persuasion looks at incidents like George Floyd, right, they may think of draw on these ideas and related ones, and see it not as unfortunate circumstance and abuse by a bad apple, or even just the racist policing, where they see something deeper, right? The ongoing violence of racial capitalism, the afterlives of slavery that are still haunting us today. So let's try to make this more concrete by talking about the role of policing in the history of the United States, right? And specifically by this, I mean the role of policing in producing, racial capitalism in the United States. So today, because of the impact of the movement for Black lives, it's increasingly common, right? Or it's increasingly recognized that police have been tied up with racial domination, right? So I'm sure many of you before before signing up for this lecture series knew that police in the United States began with slave patrols and the plantation system. This observation, however, is the starting point for a larger argument. In the antebellum United States, right, the United States before the Civil War, writers used to use the term peculiar institution as a euphemism for slavery. So today, scholars and activists have used this term to talk about the evolution of the United States across a series of peculiar institutions, from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. Right? And what's important to understand is these peculiar institutions are not, just systems of racial domination, right? They are a way of naming what's specific about all aspects of American society at a given place and time, right? They're an economic system, a racial system, a cultural system, right? It's a way to grasp the totality of American society, right? So slavery, the first and most brutal of these systems, was integral to the formation of the modern world. So foreshadowing conceptualizations of racial capitalism. W.E.B. Du Bois describes slavery as the foundation stone not only of Southern social structure, but of Northern manufacture and commerce, of the English factory system, of European commerce, of buying and selling on the world scale, right? It took waves of slave revolts, a civil war, and a general strike of black workers to end slavery in the United States. And in ending slavery in the United States, they did more than free the slaves, right? They created a new distinct era in American history, right? The United States became, after the Civil War, the United States became a industrial power. It became a world military power, right? In the terms I discussed earlier, right? The Civil War was the conflict that moved the United States from a semi-peripheral country, from what we might call a middle-income country today, to a core country, to a world power, to one of the most powerful states on the planet, right? The Jim Crow order that emerged from the wreckage of the Civil War combined formal apartheid with vigilante and police terror. Uh, and very importantly, this had an economic function. Black workers were prevented from entering high-paid industries and were locked into what Black radical and self-taught auto worker James Boggs called the scavenger role. They were a hyper-exploitable pool of common labor that formed a ceiling for blacks and a floor for whites. So after decades of civil rights organizing in the United States, overlapping and interacting with anti-colonial struggles the world over, um, we had a global revolt in 1968, right? This is a symbolic date to pull together lots of struggles against a particular ordering of racial capitalism. Right? During this time, systems of formal racial control collapsed the world over. So integration and decolonization were huge victories, but they were incomplete ones. They yielded black faces in high places, right? But they didn't undo persistent racial inequalities. So there's still a huge gulf between the formerly colonized nations and the colonizing nations. Inside the United States, right, there's still huge inequalities on race, right? Perhaps you are familiar with the discussion of the racial wealth gap, right? What happened in the United States, right? Instead of integration meaning an equalization of racial wealth, right? The United States became used imprisonment to manage racialized poverty, right? So just as the Civil War was a transition from an agricultural to an industrial country, right? The collapse of Jim Crow in the long 1960s were a transition from a industrial to post-industrial country, right? A post-industrial economy. And in this transition, right, the United States became the global leader in imprisonment, caging the disproportionately, though not exclusively, black and brown workers who are no longer needed in a lean information economy. So through these distinct forms of domination and violence, right, the capitalism has been formed and reformed in the United States, right, and policing has been formed and reformed in relation to these changes, right. So policing formed in relation to slavery, right? And it's been transformed in relation to the social struggles that brought down one peculiar institution and created the next. So in the conventional history of American policing, slave patrols are neglected. So this prehistory of policing is important because it sets the basic relations that structured subsequent development, right? Police were created not only to control labor, but to do so along racial lines. So this is very important, right? Because there's a kind of consistent theme in U.S. history, right? The racism, the structural racism against black and brown people is not only this repressive, uh, not only plays a repressive function, right? It's a productive thing. It produces whiteness. So what do I mean by this? Let's talk about the slave patrols. So starting in South Carolina in 1704, plantation owners used their economic and political power to compel other, mostly poor whites to police the slave population, right? So the poor whites who did not own slaves did not have economic interests in line with plantation owners, right? But the idea of whiteness, right, could be used to you know to to engender support for the ongoing maintenance of the plantation system, even though, right, it ran against people's economic interests, right? So what did the slave patrols do? They had broad powers. They policed the movements of slaves. They inspected their living areas, searched for contraband, broke up independent political gatherings of slaves, or independent social gatherings, to say nothing of political. As early as 1790, the city of Charleston had its own permanent paramilitary municipal police force, primarily to control the city's large population of slaves. These forces were distinct from the militia and night watches. They were armed, uniformed, and salaried. They patrolled at night and kept a reserve force for daytime emergencies. In most respects, they resemble the modern police department, right? They can be seen as one of the first modern police departments in the world, right? If we were to give an alternative global history of policing. So this system ends with the Civil War, right, that ended slavery and gave rise to a new system of racial control and class domination. So this is where the conventional history of policing begins, right? It begins in the 19th century with the problems of industry and urbanization, right? What were these problems, right? Labor unrest, but also racial mixture. All of this was compounded by the general disorder of rapid political change, right? Rapid social and political change. So in the early days, right, this is what in conventional histories of police they call the political era. Police were corrupt appendages of urban machines, right? Police departments were patronage posts, right? Politicians decided who who staffed the police, and the job was given on political terms, on the basis that people supported particular politicians. The police themselves were involved in political corruption. They ran protection rackets, with bars and saloons, brothels, opium dens. They policed the color line, right? Very importantly, right? Policing at this period was, it sounds chaotic and corrupt and crazy, but it was functional. The United States at this time was having huge influxes of immigration, right? The machine in policing was a way of integrating different ethnic groups into machine politics, right? You win the loyalty of a particular ethnic community, right? You give them jobs in the police department, right? It also was a method of dividing and conquering. So in northern cities, particularly in the earlier parts of the 19th century, right, the urban poor was not black. They were European ethnics of all different kinds. And the way these different European ethnic populations were managed was by dividing and conquering, right? So what they'd often do is send, say, Irish police to, police the German neighborhood and vice versa, right? To use policing as a means to manage the ethnic differences within American cities. So by the end of the 19th century, right, labor militancy was increasing tremendously, right? There was lots of strikes, right? In the police departments were proving unable to deal with strikes. They weren't an efficient strike-breaking force, right? So reformers sought to professionalize the police, right? They did this by creating professional distance. They wanted to break the link between the corrupt politicians, between the machines and the police force. So how did they do this? They did this by making police professionals, right? Now you had to take a civil service test to become a police officer. Now you got a salary, right? You didn't just make your money through corruption rackets, right? There were centralized headquarters and precincts. There was a division of labor, specialization, vice squads, narcotics squads, right? There's the integration of technology. First, the patrol wagon and signal system, later, radio and patrol cars. There was, in an attempt to professionalize, right? There was a creation of police academies, training, right? Modern criminology developed in this period. We're going to study crime. We're going to use, research to improve public policy, right? Um, at this period, the status of policing changed, right? It became, with the increased status, it drew different types of people, right? Particularly after the 1930s in the Great Depression, more and more WASPs wanted to be police. This changed the relationship between policing and racial formation, right? It still was, policing still enforced the color line, right? But it became an avenue for European ethnics to become white, right? So when a certain European ethnic community broke into the salaried civil service jobs, when they became teachers and cops, right? They also increasingly intermarried outside of their ethnic groups. They lost their, racialization as a European ethnic and became white, right? So it happened first with the Germans and Irish, later with the Italians, right? So I say all this just to underscore the way that, when we talk about systemic racism and policing, we're not just talking about the oppression of people of color. We're talking about the reciprocal formation of whiteness in what could be called white privilege. So again, right, there was another massive transformation, right? The end of the professional era was also the end of the industrial era, the end of the Jim Crow era, the shift to mass incarceration and a post-industrial economy, right? And policing changed with this, right? It was part of these two interrelated transitions, deindustrialization and integration. So we get, a new era of policing, right? The police, after the, riots and rebellions and heated protests and political violence of the 1960s, there was an idea that that the professionalism of police was creating a problem, that they had too much distance from the community. So what was the solution? The solution was community policing. Let's get cops out of the cars. Let's get them walking the beat. Let's get them talking to residents. Let's get them doing collaborative problem solving, right? Let's make efforts to hire more diverse police officers. So all of this also had a dark side, right? What's called broken windows policing, right? Community policing also doubles as the aggressive enforcement of quality of life issues, right? Lots of research shows that it interacts with gentrification, with the redevelopment of cities, right? So property values get devalued in American City because of the, deindustrialization and white flight, right? The low property value becomes an incentive for developers, right? But to redevelop the neighborhood, you have to drive down crime. Enter community policing, enter broken windows and quality of life enforcement, right? In recent years, there's been a shift to what's called the intelligence era or the homeland security era, right? This is essentially the integration of information technology, into policing, computers and surveillance equipment, right? We have data-driven policing, what's sometimes called intelligence-led policing, right? Right now, this is being offered as a solution to the, the post-Ferguson, the post-George Floyd crisis of police legitimacy. We can solve policing by being smarter, by being data-driven, by being objective, right? What these arguments miss is the way that our crime data itself is a reflection of the history I just ran through, right? The way it's a product of these systemic racial inequalities, right? The way that the smart policing might just be a technological gloss on racial profiling. So all of this, right? All of this is another semester-long course squeezed into one PowerPoint slide, right? There's a lot more that could be said and a lot more complexities to be presented. But the point that I'm trying to make is that, policing has changed dramatically over time, and it's changed dramatically over time in relation to big social upheavals, by changes in the basic structure of the economy, by changes in the basic structure of racial control and class domination, right? But despite these significant changes, right, there hasn't been a fundamental change, right? Policing is still mixed up in the work of labor control, and this is something that is fundamentally racialized, right? So, policing has changed, but the problems remain. And these problems can't be simply fixed by, defunding the police and shifting money to education and other social services, right? And that's because, right, law enforcement are not the only kind of police. So the term policing was first used in the 15th century as part of an elite discussion concerning how the rising states of Europe would promote commerce and encourage people to work for wages instead of living a communal life of subsistence, right? So the term police first enters the lexicon, first enters language, the same during these same transitions, right, that we were talking about earlier, during the formation of modernity or capitalism, right? Um, at this time, in this early period, any representative of government had police power, was vested with police power. In feudal England, the bailiff or sheriff was empowered to oversee peasant labor, enforce debt repayment, right, which began the association between police and the protection of property. Policing was a term used to talk more generally about the work of administering a government until the first half of the 19th century, when police departments were formed in cities in Europe and the United States. Even then, however, police work included what we now call civil administration, public health, urban planning. In its first 50 years, the responsibilities of the New York Police Department included everything from street sweeping, boiler inspection, sheltering homeless, and finding lost children. Today, such functions are spread out across various government agencies, but the implementation of social policy still retains some powers of police enforcement, right? And more importantly, right, they still are, other social policy approaches, right, are still concerned with the original concerns of the police, right? So that is to say, the protection of private property, the creation of markets, the regulation of poverty, the separation of a worthy or deserving poor from an undeserving and inscrutable criminal element, right? So this is why many people's experiences with, say, public education or social welfare agencies can be, or usually are, so oppressive, right? School expulsions and family separations are clearly wielded to enforce these standards. What's more, grant funding for social services is often tied to compliance with the war on drugs, right? The Violence Against Women Act, for example, makes law enforcement a necessary part of service provision. Social policy, in other words, is not designed to help all people equally, right? It is a police project to fabricate a particular type of social order and pacify the population, right? So when we think about, all of social policy as a, racialized form of social policing, it puts some perspective on this, right? The racial disparities in COVID-19 deaths, we should put them next to the racial disproportionality in arrest and incarceration. These are both manifestations of the discretionary power of police to manage social order, right? And they both reflect the nature of the social order, right? The deep racial inequality, right, that our world is built upon, right? So when we think about, say, this is why, right, people are demanding, a de-investment from police and a reinvestment in other fields, right? These issues are tied together, right? They share a same history. They cannot be addressed. They cannot be addressed in isolation, right? This also means, that the argument for defunding the police is more complex than saying that the armed uniformed police are bad, but the soft social police are good, right? The paternalistic power embedded in all of the helping professions, right, must be dismantled. And the work that people in this sector do must instead support autonomous and community embedded services that provide for individual needs. Educators, medical workers, domestic violence advocates, those working in related fields need retraining and harm reduction to support uh, a, in support of a rethinking of how to service people without the restrictions, the current restrictions, right, that are placed on our imaginations. Right. So how can we reimagine the helping professions? How can we reimagine social policy? So for me, a useful starting point is the idea that the opposite of the police is the commons. So the police exist not just to protect private property, but to create it. Right? Defunding the police needs to mean more than shifting budget priorities. It means abolishing the our current social order and rebuilding a new society. Right? How can we avoid the constant reproduction and recreation of the police, especially in their softer social form? Right? Keep our eyes on the prize. The goal is collective flourishing and the common acknowledgement of our shared humanity. How does this translate into actionable demands? We're not asking for, better social policy. We're not asking for kinder, gentler, better disguised cops. We're asking for the creation of the commons, right? Shared resources, infrastructure knowledge to allow communities to self-govern and thrive, right? There's a certain social democratic common sense that fits through this framing, right? A universal right to cradle to grave care, right? Universal health care, free education, child and elder care, a basic right to life, right? Guaranteed housing, an employment guarantee, basic income guarantee, right? To make these common and not another example of social policy as social police, they need to be universal and decommodified, right? Housing or healthcare is a universal human right, not a commodity that the state will selectively subsidize or restrict for the less fortunate. So this is really important. It's really important that policy measures be universal, right? When programs are conditioned and means tested, they're problems for two reasons. First, non-universal social policy becomes another apparatus to regulate the market. So to give just one example, Francis Fox Piven and Richard Cloward's classic book, Punishing the Poor on Social Welfare Policy, argues that welfare expands during economic crises to prevent unrests and contracts in boom times to compel people to sell their labor on the market. Right? Welfare is not about helping people. It's about administering the market. It's about regulating the labor market, right? Second, non-universal programs become a line of separation, and they do so in two ways. One, they can be used to divide the deserving and undeserving in ways that reinforce, expand, soften, or diffuse criminalization. And two, they can be used as a way to stir, racial and class hatred, right? The whole discourse on welfare mothers, the vilification of the so-called undeserving poor, right? This prevents and breaks up solidarity, right? So getting universal policies through is more challenging, right? And it's more challenging politically to get through because it gets to the core of issues, right? And for this reason, it can be more lasting. So with this in mind, thinking about the commons as the opposite of the police also raises a possibility of something greater, right? A faint light on the horizon that abolitionists have long labored to draw forth and that the rebellions have now made visible to many of us lost in the darkness, right? Rebuilding the commons doesn't mean expanding what we would call the public sector. It means obliterating the public and private distinction and creating a new conception of what it means to be human, what a society can be, what it means to be free. Right? Recreating the commons means more than free healthcare, education, etc. Right? It means access to things that make life worth living, decommodified and collective access to arts, culture, recreation. It means more than just access to things and services, but a new conception of community. What would our cities and towns look like if They were built in non built to meet the varied needs of people and address conflict in punitive and restorative ways. Right? We can think of the examples of community-based conflict resolution programs, violence interrupters, for example, right? Rape crisis centers, as building blocks of a reinvented commons. Right? At their best, they are community-based institutions and practices for harm reduction and redress. They are examples that point to a future where we can solve our own problems, even the most scary and serious ones, without the without the threat of police violence. So these are lofty, lofty and big long-term goals. What can happen right now? Right now, there's a lot of legislation that's been posed in Maine to decarcerate and decriminalize. Right. So these, in addition to, excuse me, what I mentioned up here, right? Defund and depolice, right? Reducing police budgets, right? Opening up resources to invest in other alternatives, right? There's things we can do now to defund and to decarcerate and decriminalize, right? So the first thing we can do is close Long Creek Youth Development Center, right? So Maine Youth Justice has been campaigning this for a long time, right? Um, they are calling for a closure of the prison and a reinvestment of resources to meet the needs of criminalized youth, right? To provide housing, healthcare, education, right? There's laws for bail reform, which would limit the number of people incarcerated in jails before trials. There's a bill for to reduce prison sentences for rehabilitative activities. Right? There's a number of proposals for decriminalization, sentencing reform, right? To make possession of drugs, um, a less serious issue, right? To authorize supervised injection facilities to reduce the harm of the opioid epidemic, right? There's a proposal to decriminalize prostitution, right? This is the Nordic model, right? That decriminalizes prostitution and aggressively targets Johns, right? It's not legalization. It's criticized by some abolitionists, but I point it out because it's it's something that's already being talked about, right? And it's something that hopefully could be politically possible in these new conditions, right? So there's a lot more that could be said. There's a lot of complex ideas that were quickly summarized, right? So with that said, I would like to open it up and take any questions that there may be.